Thank you. As you all know, strategy is not common sense. Anytime you apply common sense to strategy, you fail. If you want peace, you have to prepare for war. Strategy is governed by paradox and contradiction. Everything Dr. Cordesman said is very accurate, but the consequences are somewhat paradoxical. For example, the fact that the United States does not appear as an all-conquering lion in the Pacific is leading to the emergence of a new power, a coalition between Japan and India. Mr. Abe has been there some months. Mr. Modi just arrived. The two, in fact, have had very strong dialogues, connections, and relations since the beginning of this year. Mr. Abe's connections with India go back really his grandfather even. Mr. Ish, his grandfather went to some. So the two of them are talking, increasing dialogue, increasing diplomatic coordination, intelligence exchange. The two of them, even before Mr. Modi became Prime Minister, or even Abe became Prime Minister, collaborated indirectly but very effectively to provide Vietnam with a submarine force. Because the Vietnamese are buying the latest model of submarine, the same as the Indians, from the Russians. If the Vietnamese got these submarines, it would take them 5 to 7 years to get them fully capable. But the Indians made available the entire training establishment, which means, big garages with all the modules and components on the walls, so a sergeant can teach a junior, an NCO can teach a junior person how to use it and so on. So on one hand, the Japanese give money to Vietnam. The other, the Indians provide the training to Vietnam. The Japanese government has given patrol vessels to the Philippines, giving them to Indonesia. The Indonesians were neutral until a month ago. A month ago, they said they're going to join the coalition. This is not NATO. There's no treaty. There's no alliance. There's nothing. All of this is happening because U.S. power is enough to reassure Japan. President Obama went to Japan and said that the Senkaku Islands, the Chinese call Diaoyuan, they're fully protected, 100% protected by the U.S. treaty. If the Americans were more powerful, more effective, the Indians would not be able to step forward. The Japanese would not have a reason to do all this activity, which involves a lot of new effort and so on. That's a paradox. An all-powerful America will prevent the emergence of this coalition. This coalition emerging is rather like an island appearing in the middle of the Pacific after a volcanic eruption. Because when you think of it, Japan, India, and Vietnam have more people than China, more wealth than China, more GDP than China, and more technology arguably than China, if not more, just about the same. And of course, the United States is there to help them. The Australians come in because only the Australians have a relationship with the Malaysians. Malaysians are somewhat sleepy, but they're also threatened by China. And the Australians coordinate and bring in the Malaysians into the game. The Australians and so on. And this is of direct interest to Israel for a couple of reasons. One of them is that there is no way this coalition is going to emerge without entering into all sorts of strategic relations with Israel. Israel, of course, has strong relations with China. Israel has no reason to commit itself. Israel is not a Pacific nation threatened by China. China is no threat to Israel, so Israel is not going to jump into this. But the fact is that Mr. Modi has publicly already said that he wants to upgrade relations with Israel. There isn't much room to upgrade military exchange or trade, but there is plenty of room to do other things, maybe know-how and so on. And Japan, apparently, according to what I read in the papers, wants to enter into a strategic relationship, at least in terms of military technology and so on. So this is a fact that has a great impact on the Eastern Mediterranean. I personally, by the way, do not use British colonial term, the Middle East. Maybe Oman is the Middle East. For me, it's the Mediterranean. Think of it, the Mediterranean diet, Mediterranean climate, Mediterranean civilization. Forget about the Middle East. That's all about terrorists and wars and so on. But anyway, the other world historical change taking place, of course, is Crimea. When you think about Crimea, you realize why the Russian people control 11 time zones, why the Russians have it all and not some other of the many nationalities that are comprised within the Russian Federation. It's because the Russians may be good at nothing else. The Russian state, at least, is good at nothing else, but it's always been good at strategy. Just as the Chinese have always been good at everything except strategy. That's why they keep getting conquered and ruled by 3 or 4 men on horseback. The fact is the Russians are wonderful at strategy. Evidence of that, they take Crimea and divide NATO and divide the West. When you both take what you want and you divide your opponents, it means you're good at strategy. Grabbing something and unifying people against you, so next time they give it to you, that's the failure of strategy. So you see that you make the contrast between China, which is not practicing divide and rule, not singling out the evil Japanese and only criticizing them, or singling out the Vietnamese and so on, but instead going. Anybody who challenges all these antagonists at the same time, by definition, is no strategist. Mr. Putin, he did not move thoughtlessly. The world happens to know this, at least I know it, that they did very separate academic type studies on the German reaction, the French reaction, the British reaction, the Italian reaction. When they determined there'd be no reaction, they moved. Now, I think this is a world historical event here in the Eastern Mediterranean because it means something else, which is the failure of the European experiment. Europe will be going back to being a common market. It has failed ever since the economic crisis started. The European institutions, the European Central Bank, the Commission and so on, failed to deal with the macroeconomic crisis. They couldn't cope with it. But we kept being told that it's still a wonderful thing because there's peace and security in Europe. Turns out there is no peace and security, and more to the point, when the Russians did Crimea, where was the European President? Where was the European Commission? Where were the European institutions? Nowhere. There was only Frau Merkel, Monsieur Hollande, Mr. Cameron, no Europe. Europe didn't exist. It disappeared, poof, out to the sky. Meaning it's not there. And this is significant. It means that we're going to go back to a common market. It's going to be individual countries. And this Eastern Mediterranean country here of Israel will be dealing with other countries, Northern Mediterranean countries and continental countries and so on. These are world historical events. No less than that. And there's no other interpretation for it. Now, in terms of the emergence of the Asian coalition, this is a huge relief for the United States because this is burden sharing in a much more burden sharing than just paying the cost of housing U.S. troops, which the Japanese government has done for decades. This is true the burden sharing where you have a perceived Chinese threat, and I call it a perceived Chinese threat because I think the intentions within China go in many different directions. And you have, instead of the Americans having to carry the weight, you have this spontaneous emergence of something much better than a NATO, which is an organic, natural coalition, which is to the very great advantage of the United States, which means that it will be able to deal with this problem quite easily because of the prevalence of it. Now, when you do the arithmetic of it, you might conclude that the fact that the Japanese, the Indians, the Vietnamese have more people, more money than China, more technology, doesn't amount to anything because all of you are properly trained to know that power is mass multiplied cohesion. And 100 chickens cannot fight a lion, except that they're not quite chickens. And the amount of cohesion which we have seen just in the last 18 months is astonishing in terms of integration. I believe the next steps are going to be, for example, that when there is another of these intrusions or penetrations or incursions or takings of rocks, reefs, and so on, that there will be a unified response. That is, the foreign ministries of these different countries will come out with the same communique, exactly with the same wording, at the same time, and with a helpfully provided translation in Chinese with the same characters, and not different characters. This will be the kind of thing, and below that, substantively, a lot of military cooperation and action and so on. Now, what's going on the Chinese side is equally comprehensible. If you're in Beijing, what's happening is so open and shut, so clear and unchallengeable. You have public opinion in China saying, okay, we're not poor anymore, we're not powerless anymore. We have long claimed these islands, you know, the Xinsha, Shansha, whatever, these so-called Spratlys, Paracels, Scarborough Reefs, what are all these foreign names here to these islands and so on. Our fishermen were sleeping there centuries ago. The fact that the Filipinos fishermen were sleeping there weeks ago perhaps is not so important. So you have public opinion welling up saying, oh wait, is it really true? If you're in Beijing and watch CCTV, Chinese television, you get a picture of an all-powerful China, all-powerful, grand, magnificent, dominant China, and you say, okay, come on, bring it home, give us results. Then you have the bureaucratic pressure of the Navy that wants ships, the Army, of course, that has to have incursions over the Indian border. As you know, the Chinese claim on India is nothing less than the entire state of Arunachal Pradesh. If you think of the Indian map as a kind of big triangle, everything beyond the Brahmaputra towards Tibet, that's the whole thing, that's the claim of it. That's essential, because if you only quarrel with Japan, Philippines, Indonesia, Vietnam, and the Sultanate of Brunei, there's no role for the Army. So the Army has to have the Indian quarrel. The Navy is very happy with it, and by the way, in case you don't want to deal with the Navy, you have the Coast Guard, which is the newly unified Fisheries Protection Fleet. They used to quarrel and compete with the Maritime Surveillance Fleet. So in other words, what you have is a grand Chinese horizontal competition. The same dynamic that makes China a successful country, because the mayor of Harbin and the mayor of Shenyang, each of them want to have the biggest possible airport, the biggest possible thing. The same thing is going on between the armed forces of China. Competition, quarreling, protagonism, manifest, showing off, adventurism, all these things that we never saw with the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, you had the strict central control, Any adventuristic captain would get kicked out of the Soviet Navy and so on. Chinese captains who cut across other people's ships and grab things get praised and formed. It all makes sense from the Beijing point of view. You know, this is our time. People walked all over China, they invaded, they oppressed, they humiliated. We're going to give it to them. As for the leaders, if any of you were in a position of Mr. Xi Jinping, you would act exactly the way he's doing it. Because communism is going out of the window. Out of the window is a dead dog. There may be 3 people still singing the old Mao songs. There's still a lot of people attached to the old communism, a lot of people who have not been successful economically, who resent it and so on, but still they're a minority and they're getting older and older. So Mr. Xi Jinping has to appeal to something, so he appeals to nationalism. What could be more normal than to pull out the old tin drum of nationalism, flag waving and so on? So what's going on in China is entirely natural, and it tells you how human history is made. Human history is made by very intelligent people doing very stupid things. You see, stupid people cannot do big things. Only intelligent people can do big things. But when you have intelligent people doing stupid things, it's no use lecturing to them because they're not stupid. They're very intelligent, but they're subject to pressures, compulsions, and demands that you are not aware of, but they are living those. So what we have here is the natural workings of history, and it is having a very good effect for many people. It's going to have a good effect here in the Eastern Mediterranean because this will be the beneficiaries of this, even though I do not expect this country to choose anti-China versus China, not at all. And it's having a very beneficial effect in India, where Mr. Modi wants to impose drastic and painful reforms. He wants to disestablish interest groups. He could not do it if he couldn't point to the great Chinese threat. So Mr. Modi totally depends on it. In fact, he will evoke China in every speech he made. We have to build roads because of the China and so on. So this whole thing is highly functional in Tokyo, in New Delhi, in the Eastern Mediterranean. The only thing is that an incident might get out of hand. An incident. And there are so many little incidents that there is a possibility of that happening, in which case things change drastically, economically, overall. I would just say a final thing. When a shopkeeper goes to buy now a pair of Getas in Japan and he sees they're made in China, many people don't buy. The same thing is happening in Philippines. Same thing is happening in Indonesia. Indonesians don't take much to become anti-Chinese, so that much has been done. And so there is some negative aspect to it. Because remember, in dealing with the Soviet Union, the United States had a straight track. Everything in the Soviet Union was military power, so if you made the Soviet Union poorer, it was better, period. We cannot make China poorer without all of us becoming poorer. That is the difficulty of strategy, and that's why we are paid, and that's why it makes it interesting.